1995, El Paso, Texas. Maria Alvarez was 27, one of the youngest DEA officers assigned to undercover work on the border. Her mission? Infiltrate the cartel of Vicente Morales, the man moving tons of cocaine through Juarez into the United States. On the night before she vanished, Maria called in to her supervisors. She said she was going with the cartel to witness a major drug deal. It was the kind of opportunity that could break the case wide open. By the next morning, her car was found abandoned near the border. The driver's side door unlocked, the keys still in place. Maria was nowhere to be found. And then came the stories. Not of a fallen officer, but of a woman who betrayed her badge. DEA sources hinted she had run with cartel money. Headlines accused her of corruption. For her family, it was unbearable. For the agency, it was a scandal. And for the community, it was a mystery that refused to fade. 15 years later, the truth would finally emerge. Maria Alvarez had not run. She had been sold out. If you want to know who Maria Alvarez really was, and why she became the perfect target for both the cartel and her own agency's suspicions, stay with me. Her story is only just beginning. Make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. It helps us bring more of these untold cases to light. Next, we'll go deeper into Maria's life, her family, her career, and the path that led her straight into one of the most dangerous assignments on the border. Maria Alvarez was born in 1968 in El Paso, Texas, just a few miles from the border. Her family was part of the large Mexican-American community that defined the city. Her father, Jose Alvarez, worked long hours on construction sites, laying bricks and hauling cement in the scorching Texas sun. Her mother, Rosa, spent her days at a sewing machine, mending clothes and taking. Maria stood out from the first day. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, but she was steady. Instructors noted her discipline. Fellow cadets said she rarely joked around, always kept her focus. She wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest fighter, but she was consistent. She studied case law when others went out drinking. She volunteered for extra shifts. By the end of her first year on the force, supervisors already recognized her reliability. Her background, bilingual, familiar with the streets of El Paso, able to move between English and Spanish without hesitation, made her valuable. She handled domestic disputes, drug arrests, and cross-border intelligence work. Word spread quickly through the department. Alvarez was solid. No drama, no complaints, no shortcuts. In 1993, the Drug Enforcement Administration, facing a surge of cocaine coming through Juarez, needed young officers willing to take risks. They began pulling from local police. Maria was recruited. At just 25, she was wearing a DEA badge. For a woman in the mid-1990s, especially in Texas, this was no small achievement. Her colleagues in DEA remembered her as different from the rest. She didn't talk about herself. She didn't brag about the danger of undercover work. She was direct, practical. Her case files were organized to the last detail. She rarely went out with the others after long shifts, and she almost never brought friends to her home. Some interpreted that as coldness, but in truth, Maria was drawing a line between her dangerous job and her family. She knew the risk of letting cartel figures learn about her parents. She wasn't going to give anyone a chance. By 1995, the DEA had turned its attention to one man, Vicente Morales. He was a cartel boss who operated out of Chihuahua, Mexico, controlling the corridor through Juarez and into El Paso. Morales was in his 30s, already worth millions. His organization controlled warehouses, trucking companies, and safe houses on both. Her colleagues warned her that this was a career-defining mission. If she pulled it off, it could dismantle a major cartel route. If anything went wrong, there would be no second chance. Maria accepted the assignment without hesitation. Those who worked with her later said it was because she had already seen too many children in her community destroyed by drugs. She wasn't reckless. She was resolute. Her demeanor was often described as small but tough. At 5'5", with thick black hair pulled into a bun and steady dark eyes, she didn't try to intimidate. Instead, she listened. She let others talk. That trait, listening more than speaking, proved invaluable in undercover meetings. Criminals underestimated her. They assumed she was just another go-between, someone who could be used and discarded. They didn't realize she was recording details, memorizing routes, piecing together Morales' structure. By the summer of 1995, Maria had been working undercover for over a year. Reports from that time describe her as stressed, but still precise. Colleagues noticed she rarely smiled. Some said she was losing weight. She brushed it off, insisting she was fine. But the pressure was mounting. Friends recalled that in her rare private moments, Maria repeated one line: "I don't want to see another kid die from cocaine." It was her mantra. Yet, in the final weeks before her disappearance, those closest to her sensed a change. She was tense. She checked her watch constantly. She stepped outside the office to take calls she refused to explain. Even her voice, usually calm, sounded sharper, strained. Then came the crucial night. On September 11th, 1995, Maria contacted her supervisor in the DEA field office. She reported that Morales' men had invited her to accompany them on a major deal near the border. It was the kind of opportunity that agents wait months for. A direct window into the cartel's operations. Maria told them she would go along. It was a calculated risk, and it was the last official communication DEA ever received. Hours later, the car turned up abandoned in a lot near the border crossing. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were still hanging in the ignition. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. Papers and personal effects were gone. Maria herself was gone. From that moment, the narrative began to unravel. Rumors spread within days, whispers that she had run, that she had taken money from the cartel. The figure attached to the rumor was precise: $200,000. No one knew where the number came from, but in law enforcement circles, once a figure like that attaches to a name, it takes on the life of its own. For the public, the image was simple. A young female agent, lured by greed, gone with the money. But for those who knew her, the story didn't add up. Maria wasn't the type to gamble everything. She wasn't flashy, didn't chase luxury, never took unnecessary chances with her finances. Still, the gossip took hold, and in the absence of her body, the absence of evidence, the whispers became accepted as fact. Her family was devastated. Rosa Alvarez told neighbors her daughter would never betray her oath. But Jose, her father, avoided conversations altogether. He kept working, hammering nails, pouring cement, until exhaustion drove him home. He couldn't fight the tide of suspicion that engulfed his family. Inside the DEA, doubts spread. Some agents defended her. Others muttered that she had gone dirty. Supervisors had to deal with the optics. A missing agent is a scandal. A missing agent rumored to have stolen money is worse. But before those doubts hardened into official judgment, one fact remained. The night before she vanished, Maria Alvarez had called her supervisors. She said she was going with Morales' men to a major deal. She gave them notice. And she never came back. That detail, the last report from Maria herself, still hangs heavy over the timeline. September 12th, 1995. It began like a normal day, but by nightfall, Maria Alvarez would vanish from the map, and the rumors that followed would destroy her name. That afternoon, Maria gave her final report to her DEA superiors. She said she was going in deep. That night, she would join Morales' crew for a major cocaine transaction near the border. This wasn't just another buy and bust. This deal was different. Maria told her handlers that she might finally get a glimpse of Vicente Morales himself. For years, Morales had been a ghost. DEA had stacks of surveillance photos, but none confirmed his identity. They had dozens of faces, but no certainty about which man was the true boss. Agents were hesitant. Arrest the wrong people and the real kingpin would slip away forever. Maria's mission was critical. If she could confirm Morales' identity, it would be the breakthrough DEA had been waiting for. That was the last piece of information her superiors received from her. By evening, traffic cameras caught Maria's sedan heading south. The car was seen moving steadily toward the El Paso Juarez corridor, the very artery through which tons of cocaine crossed each year. After that, there were no more sightings. No checkpoints logged her plates. No border officers recalled seeing her. By 9 p.m., her radio went silent. There were no updates, no distress signals, no coded calls for backup. She was simply gone. Inside DEA offices, the silence was unsettling, but at first no one panicked. Undercover work was unpredictable. Going dark for a few hours was not unusual. But as the night dragged on with no word, unease began to grow. The first whispers came from informants. Some claimed they'd heard that one of Morales' men had taken cartel money and fled. The story was vague, inconsistent, and unverified. The name of the supposed defector was never given. But the suggestion— there were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no bloodstains, no fingerprints that didn't belong to her. The scene looked less like a kidnapping and more like someone had parked the car and walked away. That detail fueled the first major narrative shift. Within days, the whispers turned into headlines. Rumors spread that Maria hadn't been kidnapped or killed at all. Instead, she had run. The figure attached to the story was staggering: $200,000. The claim was simple and brutal. Maria Alvarez had betrayed her badge, taken cartel money, and disappeared. The rumor didn't come from nowhere. Morales' cartel had always been skilled at psychological warfare. This time they played their hand perfectly. By seeding the story of betrayal, they didn't just remove suspicion from themselves. They turned Maria into the villain, and the damage was immediate. Inside DEA, reactions split. Some colleagues swore Maria would never cross the line. They had worked alongside her for years, seen her discipline, her caution, her quiet commitment to the mission. But others, including superiors who had never fully trusted her, leaned into the rumors. To them, the lack of a body was telling. No evidence of violence meant no crime. Maybe she had chosen to disappear. The more the rumors spread, the easier it was to believe. The money, the missing weapon, the abandoned car, it all seemed to fit. Maria Alvarez, once seen as a rising star, was now whispered about as a traitor. Her family refused to accept it. Jose and Rosa Alvarez stood in front of cameras and pleaded, "Maria is not a traitor. She would never betray her country." But their voices were drowned out. The media had already seized the story. Local papers hinted at DEA incompetence. National outlets questioned whether the agency had the discipline to keep its own agents clean. DEA officer defects with drug money was the kind of headline that sold. The community turned cold. Neighbors who once praised Maria as a role model now crossed the street to avoid her family. Kids at school whispered about the cop who ran away with drug dealers. In El Paso, a city already scarred by the drug war, the narrative was toxic. Maria wasn't just missing. She was disgraced. Within DEA, the fallout was devastating. The agency had no body, no crime scene, no hard proof. But in the absence of answers, suspicion filled the void. Senior officials began to treat the case not as a disappearance, but as a scandal. They pulled her file, reviewed her finances, checked her phone records. They looked for anything that might prove she had been compromised. Every time a question was raised, the lack of evidence only seemed to confirm the worst. Her closest ally, fellow officer John Ramirez, tried to defend her. He argued that Maria had been set up, that the evidence didn't add up. But his voice was isolated. The higher ranks were convinced. The cartel's story had worked. The investigation lost its focus. Instead of looking for Morales' network, the agency spent weeks chasing down Maria's supposed betrayal. Leads went cold. Informants withdrew. By October, just 1 month after her disappearance, the official stance inside DEA was grim. Maria Alvarez had abandoned her post. For the Alvarez family, it was a nightmare. They wrote letters, they begged for further investigation, they tried to get lawmakers involved. But the stain of betrayal was too strong. The more they fought, the more people turned away. Over time, the case shifted fully. No longer treated as a missing officer, it became a scandal file, classified as a probable defection. And once the label stuck, Maria's name was dragged through the mud. Her car sat in an evidence lot, collecting dust. Her personal belongings were returned to her family in a box. No ceremony. By late 1995, the investigation was stalled. The absence of a body was interpreted not as a sign of foul play, but as proof of desertion. The official files carried the phrase, "unresolved." But inside the halls of DEA, her name was already spoken as if she were guilty. And so, the story of Maria Alvarez began to rot. She had vanished into the desert, but her reputation had been buried under lies. The last question was never about where she was or what had happened to her. Instead, the question became, who stood to gain from destroying her name? And that question would push the case into its darkest chapter. The disappearance of Maria Alvarez should have triggered a manhunt. A decorated officer vanishes in the middle of an undercover operation. Her car is found abandoned, no contact, no answers. But instead of being treated like a victim, Maria was quickly painted as something else entirely. From the moment her car was discovered near the El Paso-Juarez border, the DEA launched an internal investigation. Agents swept through the vehicle, looking for fingerprints, DNA, or any sign of a struggle. Nothing. The sedan was intact. The driver's door was ajar, keys still in the ignition, personal documents left behind. To many, that absence of violence was suspicious. If this was a kidnapping, where was the chaos? Where were the signs of resistance? Detectives combed the desert around the parking lot but found nothing more than tire tracks from other vehicles. No blood, no shell casings, no disturbed sand. For the investigators on the ground, it felt like Maria had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into the desert night. Behind the scenes, supervisors in the DEA began to dig into her professional record. Every case file she had touched was re-examined. Her communications were reviewed. Informants she had worked with were questioned. Still, there was nothing pointing to a clear abduction. Nothing proving she... Inside the agency, the reaction was split. Some of her colleagues refused to believe it. John Ramirez, her teammate and one of the last people to see her alive, insisted Maria was loyal. He told investigators she had been tense in the days before she vanished, but never once suggested she was planning to defect. She wasn't scared for herself, he recalled later. She was focused on the job. She wanted Morales, that's it. but others were less certain. Supervisors, already under enormous pressure to explain how an undercover officer could vanish without a trace, started leaning toward the betrayal narrative. After all, if Maria had been kidnapped or killed, that would mean the cartel had outplayed the DEA. If she had stolen the money and fled, then at least it was a personal failure, not an institutional one. It was easier to accept disgrace than defeat. The interrogations intensified. Ramirez was called back multiple times. Every answer he gave was cross-examined. Did Maria ever complain about money? Did she ever hint at leaving the job? Did she have debts? Ramirez denied all of it, but the investigators were not satisfied. Meanwhile, cartel sources, never reliable, always manipulative, fed agents a steady drip of poison. They claimed Maria had betrayed her badge, that she had taken cartel cash and crossed the border on her own terms. Every story they told was slightly different, but all ended with the same conclusion. Maria was gone, and she had chosen to leave. The DEA allowed itself to be distracted. Instead of asking who stood to gain from destroying Maria's reputation, they took the bait. The possibility of an internal mole, someone feeding information to Morales, was largely ignored. What mattered most was managing the scandal, and the scandal was growing fast. By late 1995, national newspapers were running with the story. DEA agent runs off with cartel money, screamed. The pressure from Washington was relentless. Congressional staffers demanded answers. Local communities wanted reassurance that the DEA was still in control. Under that spotlight, Maria's supervisors chose a public relations strategy instead of a search strategy. In an official statement, they admitted irregularities in her case and promised to tighten recruitment and training. The words rang like a confession. For the Alvarez family, it was devastating. Their daughter was no longer being described as a missing officer. She was being branded as a rogue. Within a few months, Maria's public image collapsed. On posters and plaques, she had once been presented as one of the few women in DEA field operations, a rising star in the fight against border cartels. By 1996, she was remembered as the face of betrayal. In closed-door briefings, her name was written down in cold, bureaucratic language. Probable defector. The investigation that should have fought to prove what happened to Maria was instead consumed by office politics, falsified paperwork, and unverified rumors. Her colleagues stopped talking about her as a victim. Her superiors stopped pushing for answers. And that was the final insult. Maria hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased. The case that should have been about finding a missing officer turned into an internal scandal. The truth was buried under forged evidence, manipulated wiretaps, and whispers designed to humiliate the agency. The cartel had succeeded twice. First, by eliminating Maria, and second, by turning her disappearance into a weapon against the DEA itself. By the time the agency quietly closed her file, the narrative was sealed. Maria Alvarez wasn't treated as someone who had died in service. She was treated as a disgrace. Her name carried the stain of betrayal. For her family, the betrayal cut even deeper. They had pleaded with reporters, begged officials not to believe the lies. In the end, the silence became overwhelming. Neighbors avoided the Alvarez home. Children whispered at school. The stigma spread until Maria's parents lived under a shadow they could not escape. And so the DEA moved on, chalking up her disappearance as another lesson in the dangers of infiltration, while quietly filing her name under betrayal. But the truth, the real truth, was still out there, buried beneath years of lies. The investigation that should have uncovered her killers instead covered for a traitor. And 15 years later, when that truth finally broke open, it would shock everyone who had believed the story of Maria Alvarez, the so-called defector. Because Maria never betrayed her badge. She was betrayed by the very institution sworn to protect her. And the cartel wasn't the only enemy she faced. One of her own had sold her out. When the DEA closed her file, Maria Alvarez was no longer considered a victim. She was recorded as a traitor. But in the years that followed, silence and prejudice erased the truth, until one day, 15 years later, when a name resurfaced that tore the story apart. By the start of 1996, the case of Maria Alvarez was no longer treated as an open investigation. The DEA quietly closed her file. Without a body, without a crime scene, and with rumors spreading faster than facts, the agency stamped her case with a chilling label: probable defection. The official line hardened. Maria Alvarez was no longer a missing officer. She was an agent who had walked away from her oath. She had, in their eyes, abandoned her badge. The media seized on it. Major newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. DEA agent vanishes with cartel cash. That was the headline repeated in city after city. Talk radio hosts joked about another crooked cop. TV commentators shook their heads. The weight of humiliation grew heavier with each passing year. Neighbors whispered that his daughter had shamed the family. Old friends avoided eye contact in church. By the early 2000s, Jose's health gave out. He died, described by those who knew him as a broken man who never stopped defending his daughter's name. Rosa Alvarez, Maria's mother, followed a different path. Once known as a warm and steady presence in her community, Rosa withdrew from public life. She stopped attending church. She stopped social gatherings. Over time, grief and isolation pulled her into a spiral of paranoia and instability. Neighbors who remembered her before Maria's disappearance said she seemed like a shadow of herself, mumbling about conspiracies and betrayal, barely able to trust anyone. The collapse of the Alvarez family became part of the cruel legacy of the case. A father dead from heartbreak, a mother lost in grief, a daughter erased from honor and remembered only as a warning. The community in El Paso did not come to their defense. In fact, they joined in the judgment. Maria's name turned into shorthand for betrayal. At the police academy, instructors whispered warnings to new recruits. Don't end up like Alvarez. At DEA offices, her file was occasionally cited during internal reviews, not as a reminder of a dangerous undercover mission, but as a lesson in failure. She was painted as a cautionary tale, not as an officer who had risked her life. For 15 years, Maria Alvarez was remembered not as a victim, but as the face of corruption. Inside the DEA, silence became policy. John Ramirez, one of Maria's closest colleagues, lived with constant doubt. He had stood by her at first, insisting she was loyal. But pressure from supervisors and endless whispers wore him down. He stopped speaking up. Years later, Ramirez admitted, "We let her down. We stopped looking because it was easier to believe the worst." His words captured the truth, that she had been loyal, that she had been targeted, that she had been murdered, remained buried under lies. It was the perfect outcome for the cartel. Their enemy had been silenced. Their infiltration of the DEA went undetected, and the entire community believed a false story that served their interests. For 15 long years, silence replaced justice. But in 2010, everything changed. That year, the DEA, working with Mexican authorities, captured Vicente Morales, the cartel boss Maria had been sent to expose. Morales was no ordinary figure. For 2 decades he had been a ghost, careful never to show his face, cautious about every move. He had survived countless raids, avoided extradition, and built a reputation as one of the most ruthless traffickers along the Juarez-El Paso corridor. When he was finally caught, Morales faced the possibility of a death sentence in Mexico or life without parole in the United States. To save himself, he offered information. He was willing to trade secrets for leniency. And in that bargaining room, the truth that had been buried for 15 years began to surface. Morales revealed what no one in the DEA wanted to hear. Maria Alvarez had never betrayed her badge. She had never stolen cartel money. She had been loyal to the very end. Morales admitted that someone inside the DEA had given him her name. An insider had exposed her as an undercover agent. That tip sealed her fate. The man he named was Thomas Keller. According to Morales, Keller had taken bribes, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in exchange for leaking the identities of DEA operatives. When Maria got too close to Morales's inner circle, Keller delivered her name to the cartel. Morales described what happened next in chilling detail. Maria was taken across the border into Juarez. She was interrogated, tortured, and executed the same night she disappeared. Her body, the community in El Paso, once quick to condemn, now faced the reality that they had judged an innocent woman. The whispers, the insults, the isolation they had forced upon the Alvarez family, all of it had been built on lies. For John Ramirez, the truth was unbearable. He admitted his guilt openly. We let Keller frame her. We let the cartel define her legacy. We gave up on her when she needed us most. The silence that had defined Maria's case for 15 years was broken. And once the truth was out, nothing could undo the damage. Her honor could be restored on paper. Her service could be recognized. But the years of betrayal, the collapse of her family, and her own brutal death could never be erased. The case of Maria Alvarez stood as a grim reminder of what happens when lies go unchallenged, when agencies choose the easy explanation over the hard truth, and when betrayal comes from within. And yet, even in death, Maria's story wasn't finished. Because the man who had orchestrated her downfall, Thomas Keller, was still free. That would soon change. In 2010, with Morales's testimony on record, the DEA launched a new investigation, this time into one of their own. And for the first time since 1995, justice for Maria Alvarez no longer seemed impossible. If you've stayed with this story until now, you can see how Maria Alvarez was silenced not only by the cartel, but also by the lies inside her own agency. For 15 years, her name carried the weight of betrayal. Her family was destroyed. Her community turned its back. But in 2010, one arrest would change everything. The cartel boss Maria tried to expose was finally in handcuffs. And in that moment, the truth about her disappearance began to unravel. What really happened to Maria? Who inside the DEA sold her out? For 15 years, Morales had been the ghost that haunted both sides of the border. His name carried weight in El Paso and Juarez, but his face was almost mythical. Few agents had ever seen him in person. He ran cocaine shipments worth millions, bribed officials on both sides, and ordered executions with a simple nod. Maria Alvarez had once been tasked with getting close enough to identify him, but she vanished before she could. Now, in 2010, Morales was finally in chains. His arrest was not just a victory, it was an opportunity. Morales faced the kind of charges that guaranteed he would never walk free again. Conspiracy, racketeering, drug trafficking, kidnapping, murder. Federal prosecutors hinted they would seek the death penalty if he refused to cooperate. And so Morales did what many cartel bosses eventually do when the walls close in. He bargained. During his debriefings, he began to recount stories of past crimes, routes, shipments, names of corrupt officials. The DEA listened carefully, but then a familiar name surfaced. Maria Alvarez. The room went silent. For most agents, Alvarez was little more than a footnote by then, a cautionary tale scribbled in an old training manual. A woman who had supposedly crossed the line. The agency had moved on. But when Morales mentioned her, everyone leaned forward. Morales smirked. "She never betrayed you," he said. "You betrayed her." The interrogators pressed him for details. Morales explained that back in 1995, his organization had been tipped off that Maria was not who she claimed to be. She was undercover, sent by the DEA, and the warning didn't come from a rival gang or a careless mistake on her part. It came from inside the agency itself. The admission stunned the room. For years, the DEA had accepted the narrative that Alvarez had defected, that she had vanished with money meant. Morales explained how Keller not only exposed her identity, but also helped build a cover story after she disappeared. Keller planted false financial records, showing supposed irregular spending in Maria's accounts. He slipped forged memos into her file, suggesting she had been under suspicion. He whispered doubts into the ears of her colleagues, feeding a narrative that she had chosen money over duty. When cartel rumors reached the press, Keller made sure they stuck. By the end of 1995, Maria wasn't remembered as a fallen officer. She was branded as a traitor. The interrogators pushed Morales to explain what had really happened on the night Maria vanished. His answer was chilling. According to Morales, Maria never made it back to El Paso. She was intercepted near the border and driven into Juarez. There, in a cartel safehouse, she was interrogated about what she knew. Morales admitted he wasn't present that night, but he gave orders that no undercover agent could be allowed to live. Maria was tortured and killed the same evening. Her body was dumped in the desert outside the city, burned and buried in a shallow grave. Morales said she was gone before sunrise. Her death was swift. Her reputation was destroyed much slower. Back in 1995, while her family begged for answers, the cartel spread carefully crafted rumors. A female officer had stolen money. She had disappeared into Mexico with cartel cash. Keller then added his own pieces to the puzzle, providing false leads that backed up the story. By the time the DEA filed its final reports, Maria wasn't listed as a casualty of duty. She was recorded as a probable defection. The agents in the 2010 debriefing couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some dismissed Morales as a liar trying to buy time, but others began to dig into his claims. Slowly, the pieces started to fit. Financial audits revealed Keller's unexplained assets, overseas accounts. For the Alvarez family, The news spread slowly. Rosa, Maria's mother, was already frail and withdrawn after years of humiliation. When she learned that her daughter had been innocent all along, she wept, not with joy, but with exhaustion. For 15 years she had lived under the shadow of disgrace. Now she learned the truth, but it had arrived far too late. For John Ramirez, Maria's closest colleague, the revelations confirmed his worst suspicions. He had defended Maria after her disappearance, insisting she would never run. But the years of doubt, the pressure from superiors, the relentless rumors, they had worn him down. He eventually convinced himself she might have done it. Now, hearing Morales's testimony, Ramirez felt both vindicated and crushed. Maria had been loyal to the end, and he had not stood by her. Inside the DEA, the case that had once been a footnote now became an urgent crisis. A veteran investigator, once trusted, once celebrated, was being accused of treason by one of the most notorious cartel bosses on the continent. The agency could no longer ignore the inconsistencies in Maria's file. They had to reopen the case. But the questions weren't just about Keller. They were about the DEA itself. How could the agency allow one of its own to sell out a colleague? How could false documents be planted without detection? How could an innocent officer be branded a traitor, while the real traitor collected a paycheck and promotions? Morales's confession cracked the case open, but it also exposed the culture of silence that had let Keller operate for so long. Maria Alvarez had been betrayed twice, once by a colleague who sold her out, and once by an agency that chose to believe the worst instead of fighting for the truth. For 15 years, Maria's name had been synonymous with betrayal. Now the truth was surfacing, and it carried a devastating. For the first time in 15 years, the truth of Maria Alvarez's disappearance was within reach. But with that truth came new questions. Questions that would shake the DEA to its core. If Maria had been betrayed from the inside, how many others had faced the same fate? And how could an agency sworn to protect its agents allow this to happen in silence? In 2010, the lies finally collapsed. The truth about Maria Alvarez came to light, not from investigators, not from her colleagues, but from the very man who had ordered her death. And what he revealed would shock not just her family, but the entire agency that had abandoned her. For 15 years, the disappearance of Maria Alvarez sat in silence. Her name was tied to rumors of betrayal, her family forced to live under the weight of suspicion, and the DEA quietly turned the page. But in 2010, when cartel leader Vicente Morales was finally in custody, that silence broke. What he revealed would change everything. During a series of official debriefings, Morales began to talk. He was facing life behind bars and, possibly worse, cooperation was his only bargaining chip. At first, investigators expected the usual: names of lieutenants, smuggling routes, financial channels. But then a name from the past came up: Maria Alvarez. Morales leaned forward and said what no one had dared to say in over a decade. Maria had never betrayed her oath. She had not taken money. She had not defected. According to Morales, she was loyal until her last breath. He went further. He told investigators that the cartel had known she was undercover because someone inside the DEA told them. That someone was Thomas Keller, a decorated investigator who had been celebrated within the agency for years. Morales called him the best investment the cartel ever made. Morales provided details of what happened the night Maria vanished. According to him, After she drove toward the border for a meeting she had reported to her superiors, cartel members intercepted her route. She was taken quietly across into Juarez, a city under heavy cartel control at the time. Morales claimed she was brought to a house the cartel used as a secure location. Inside, she was questioned about DEA operations. Who else was undercover? What they knew about Morales? What evidence had been collected? Investigators asked Morales how much she revealed. His answer was blunt. Nothing useful. She stayed silent. Later that night, under Morales's orders, her life was taken. He offered no emotion, no hesitation as he spoke. For him, it was business. For investigators, it was the end of the mystery. Maria had not run away. She had been silenced because someone inside her own agency had sold her out. Morales explained that the cartel had gone to great lengths to ensure no trace of Maria would be found. Her body, he said, was taken to the desert outside Juarez, buried in a shallow grave, left in a place where wind and sand would erase all signs within weeks. That decision was deliberate. Morales told investigators, "If there's no body, the story is whatever we decide it is." For 15 years, that strategy worked. There was no crime scene for DEA to investigate, no remains for the family to bury, and no evidence to prove anything beyond rumors. Morales then admitted that the cartel wasted no time in shaping the story. Within days of her disappearance, they spread whispers through informants that a female agent had stolen money from a shipment. They put numbers to the lie, $200,000. Enough to sound plausible, enough to sting the reputation of the DEA. At the same time, Keller made sure those same lies appeared inside DEA files. Financial documents showed irregularities. Reports suggested Maria had been seen in places she had never been. Even intercepted conversations were fabricated or taken out of context. Piece by piece, a false story was built until it looked convincing. Morales's cartel and Keller's position inside DEA worked together seamlessly. By the end of 1995, the official narrative was set. Maria Alvarez had betrayed her badge. The damage was enormous. For 15 years, Maria's name was used as an example of failure. New DEA recruits heard her case in training sessions, not as a cautionary tale of sacrifice, but as a warning of corruption. Her face, once representing courage in El Paso, became tied to shame. Families of other officers whispered her name as a reminder of what not to do. Communities that once trusted her family turned their backs. And all the while, the truth sat buried in the desert. Morales admitted that destroying Maria's image had been as important to the cartel as stopping her investigation. "If people think she ran," he told agents, "they stop looking for what really happened." Once Morales's confession was on record, federal investigators began re-examining the old files. The anomalies jumped out immediately. Financial documents that had supposedly shown Maria's suspicious spending were traced back to Keller's desk. They bore formatting and signatures that no longer matched official templates. Memos that painted her as unreliable were unsigned, with metadata pointing to Keller's access. Even the log entry. The reaction inside DEA was immediate and devastating. For years, Keller had been a respected figure. He had lectured at conferences, mentored young agents, and been praised for his dedication. Now, all of it collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Agents who had worked with him felt betrayed. Many admitted they had doubted Maria's loyalty back in 1995, and now realized they had been manipulated. One senior official put it plainly, "We failed her twice, first in life, then in death." For John Ramirez, Maria's closest colleague, the revelations cut deep. He had defended her at first, but when the evidence against her mounted, even he had started to question. Now, faced with the truth, he told investigators, "I should have trusted my gut. She was always straight. We abandoned her." When the revelations leaked to the press, the story turned overnight. Newspapers that had once called Maria a traitor now ran headlines that read, "DEA agent betrayed by insider," and "15-year-old lies exposed." The community in El Paso, which had judged the Alvarez family harshly, now faced the truth of what they had done. Neighbors who had once whispered insults now left flowers at the Alvarez home. But for Rosa Alvarez, who had lived through years of isolation and grief, it was too late to heal the wounds. Anger grew nationwide. Commentators asked how the DEA could allow one of its own to destroy a loyal officer's reputation for 15 years. Others questioned whether Keller had acted alone, or whether higher officials had looked the other way. For the Alvarez family, the vindication was bittersweet. The truth was finally coming out, but the father who had fought for Maria's honor was long gone. Her mother's health was broken. Maria herself had no chance to see her name cleared. By the end of 2010, Morales's confession had changed the case completely. Maria Alvarez was no longer seen as a traitor. By the end of 2010, the truth about Maria Alvarez was finally clear. Vicente Morales, the cartel boss she had been assigned to infiltrate, had confessed. He admitted Maria never betrayed her oath. He admitted she was killed because someone inside the DEA revealed her identity. And he named Thomas Keller as the traitor. The confession tore apart 15 years of lies. It forced the DEA to act. For the Alvarez family, it was vindication, but one that arrived far too late. And for Keller, it was the beginning of a reckoning. In December 2010, Keller was quietly placed under surveillance. He had been with the DEA for more than 2 decades, long respected as a senior investigator. Colleagues who had once trusted him noticed nothing unusual. On the surface, Keller looked like the same polished agent he had always been. But behind the scenes, federal auditors tracked his finances. They uncovered luxury purchases, overseas accounts, and unexplained deposits that matched the timeline of cartel payments described by Morales. They also reviewed internal systems. Each forged memo discrediting Maria, each irregular financial report tied to her file, had originated from Keller's access. With enough evidence in hand, federal marshals moved in. Keller was arrested at his suburban home outside Houston. For neighbors, the news was shocking. For DEA agents, it was devastating. The indictment laid out the case. Keller was charged with conspiracy, corruption, obstruction of justice, and indirect responsibility for Maria's death. Prosecutors emphasized that by selling her identity, Keller had delivered her into the hands of the cartel. His forgeries and planted evidence ensured that the DEA never pursued the truth. For Maria's family, the charges confirmed what they had long suspected. She had been betrayed, not by weakness, but by someone who wore the same badge. The trial over. Keller's attorneys tried to paint Morales as unreliable, a cartel boss seeking to reduce his sentence by blaming someone else. They argued that Keller's finances, though unusual, did not directly connect him to cartel money. They suggested he was a scapegoat for an agency embarrassed by its own failures. But the defense fell apart when prosecutors presented audit trails showing Keller's computer access at the exact times the forged documents appeared. One by one, the lies crumbled. When Keller took the stand, observers hoped for remorse. They hoped he might acknowledge his betrayal. Instead, his testimony stunned the courtroom. When asked directly whether he regretted his actions, Keller looked toward the Alvarez family and said, "No. She cost me everything. That woman ruined my career before it even began. If I had to do it again, I would." Gasps filled the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Rosa Alvarez collapsed into tears. Colleagues who had once worked with Keller shook their heads in disbelief. Keller's words revealed what prosecutors had argued all along. He had not been pressured. He had not been tricked. He had chosen to betray Maria, and he felt no shame. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated less than 2 days. The evidence was too strong, Keller's arrogance too blatant. He was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy with a criminal organization, corruption, obstruction, and indirect responsibility for the death of Officer Maria Alvarez. The judge delivered the sentence firmly: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Keller, once hailed as a model DEA investigator, it was the end. For the Alvarez family, it was not closure. Nothing could bring Maria back. But it was justice. When the verdict was read, Rosa Alvarez wept openly. Relatives held her as she whispered, "She never betrayed us." She never betrayed her oath. It was vindication, but one that came 15 years. Inside the DEA, Keller's conviction sent shockwaves. For years, Maria's case had been used as a warning, proof of what happened when an agent supposedly went rogue. Now it became a symbol of institutional failure. Officials issued statements acknowledging mistakes. "We failed Maria Alvarez," one senior agent admitted. "We accepted lies because they were easier than the truth. We owe her and her family more than words." For John Ramirez, Maria's closest colleague, the verdict was personal. He confessed in interviews, "I doubted her when I shouldn't have. I let them convince me she had betrayed us. That guilt doesn't go away." Maria Alvarez had been loyal until the end. She had given her life in the fight against the cartel. Yet for 15 years her name was dragged through the mud. Her father died in despair. Her mother lived with humiliation and grief. Her colleagues questioned her loyalty, and the agency she served allowed the lies to stand. The truth finally came out, but too late for Maria, too late for her father, and too late to undo the damage done to her family's honor. By 2011, Keller was behind bars. Morales remained in custody, and Maria Alvarez's name was finally cleared. The DEA prepared a formal statement recognizing her sacrifice. A memorial stone was placed in her honor in El Paso. But the story of Maria Alvarez is not just about betrayal and justice. It is about the silence that allowed lies to stand for so long, and the cost of waiting too late to seek the truth. In 2011, 16 years after Maria Alvarez vanished near the border, the DEA held a ceremony in El Paso. It was quiet, formal, and heavy with regret. At last, the agency admitted what her family had always known. Maria had not been a traitor. She had not stolen cartel money. She had not abandoned her badge. She had died. "I let doubt win," he said. "I stood back when I should have stood up." Maria Alvarez was loyal to the end, and she paid the highest price. We cannot undo what was done to her, but we can ensure it never happens again. We can never allow silence or politics or convenience to bury the truth. For some in the audience, his words hit hard. because the truth was undeniable. Maria had been betrayed twice. First by a fellow officer who sold her out, then by an agency that accepted lies because it was easier than facing uncomfortable questions. In the front row, Rosa Alvarez sat quietly. She was thin, frail, her hands trembling as she clutched the program with her daughter's photo on the cover. Her husband, Jose, had died years earlier, worn down by grief and humiliation. Rosa was all that remained of the family that had once been proud of their daughter's badge. When the official proclamation was read, declaring Maria innocent, recognizing her as having died in service, Rosa did not cry. She did not smile. Those who saw her that day described her expression as empty, distant. The truth had finally come, but it had come after her life had already been shattered. For Rosa, the vindication was too late to heal anything. The community of El Paso, however, responded with remorse. For 15 years, Maria's name had been used as shorthand for betrayal. Parents whispered to their children not to end up like her. Recruits at the police academy were told her story as a cautionary tale. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid the Alvarez family. Now, all of it was exposed as false. Local residents organized vigils. Candles were lit outside the Alvarez home. Old neighbors came forward to apologize. Newspapers that once ran bold headlines like "DEA agent runs off with cartel cash" now printed new ones. From traitor to hero, the truth about Maria Alvarez. The shift was dramatic, but for those closest to Maria, it was also painful, because apologies could not erase the years of shame, the broken family, the father who died without ever hearing his daughter cleared. For many, the story of Maria Alvarez became more than just the tragedy of one officer. It became a lesson about the consequences of silence, about the danger of accepting rumors as fact, and about the cost of betrayal inside an organization meant to uphold justice. The DEA itself faced internal reckoning. Training manuals were rewritten. New guidelines were established for how missing officer cases should be handled. Maria's file, once stamped as probable defection, was now used as a case study on the importance of due diligence. During those sessions, instructors reminded new agents, evidence must guide you, not rumors. Never assume betrayal. At conferences, her story was cited as an example of why whistleblowers and doubters must be heard, not silenced. Why internal corruption can destroy more than a single life. Why the truth, even when inconvenient, must always be pursued. In broader society, the case sparked conversations about media responsibility. Newspapers that had once printed rumor as fact were forced to confront their role. They had amplified cartel disinformation, turning lies into headlines, and shaping public opinion against a woman who could no longer defend herself. One editorial in 2011 admitted, "We allowed unverified sources to stain a name. We became part of the cartel's campaign without realizing it. For this, the press must accept responsibility." But admissions, apologies, and ceremonies could not bring Maria back. They could not restore the years lost to shame. They could not erase the pain of a father who went to his grave branded as the parent of a traitor, or a mother who lived in isolation because of whispered judgments. In the end, the vindication of Maria Alvarez stood as both a triumph of truth and a condemnation of the system that failed her. The closing image is one of contrast, a memorial stone in El Paso, polished, official, bearing the words, "Died in the line of duty," And behind that stone, a story of silence, betrayal, and a family broken beyond repair. The lesson is harsh but clear. Betrayal does not always come from enemies across the border. Sometimes, it comes from the person sitting across the desk. And when institutions choose convenience over truth, they become accomplices in injustice. The final words spoken at the ceremony lingered long after the crowd dispersed. You can hide a death, but you cannot bury the truth forever. That was the truth Maria's story proved. For 15 years, lies were strong. If you followed this story, take a moment to reflect. Think about how quickly rumors can destroy a reputation, how silence can bury the truth, and how important it is to demand answers even when the evidence seems incomplete. And if you've ever seen someone falsely accused, whether in your family, your workplace, or your community, remember the Alvarez family. Speak up. Don't let silence become complicity. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep telling the stories of those who were silenced too soon. Because the story of Maria Alvarez is not only about betrayal and tragedy, it is also about the persistence of truth. And as we close this chapter, we open another. Because if one woman could be falsely branded a traitor for 15 years, what happens when an entire family vanishes without a trace, leaving only a car at the edge of a canyon? That story is next.